The order arrived with the morning fog that rolled off Yokohama harbor, carried in a voice that seemed to strip away the last remnants of dignity. The date was September 3rd, 1945, just days after the surrender documents had been signed aboard the USS Missouri. For the 450 Japanese women standing in formation on the concrete pier, time had collapsed into this single moment of dread. All personnel will remove outer garments for inspection. The words came through a loudspeaker, translated by a Japanese officer who could barely meet their eyes. His voice cracked on the final syllable, a small betrayal of emotion in a moment that demanded none. Around them, the machinery of occupation hummed with purpose. American jeeps rolling past in precise intervals, cargo ships being unloaded with mechanical efficiency, and everywhere the strange new flags that represented defeat. These women were not soldiers. They were nurses, clerks, teachers, telegraph operators, cooks. Some had worked in military hospitals, others in communication centers. A few had been attached to diplomatic missions in China and Manchuria. Now they were prisoners, though no one had yet used that word. The American forces called them detainees pending repatriation. The distinction felt meaningless when you were standing on foreign concrete, surrounded by armed guards being told to undress. Fumiko Tanaka stood in the third row, her hospital white stained brown from the journey. She had been a head nurse at a field hospital near Harbin before the Soviet invasion scattered her unit like leaves in a storm. The retreat had been chaos. Burning documents, abandoned equipment, civilians trampled in the panic to reach the trains heading south. She'd made it to Korea, then to a ship bound for Japan, only to be intercepted by American forces in international waters. The memory of her training came back in fragments. Her instructor, a stern woman named Matron Sato, had once told her class, "A nurse must maintain composure even when facing death. Your dignity is your uniform, your honor is your service." But Matron Sato had never imagined this scenario. No one had. The woman beside Fumiko whispered, "They're going to kill us." Her name was Keiko, a radio operator barely 20 years old. Her hands trembled as she gripped the hem of her jacket. "This is how it begins. I heard stories from China, the things they do to prisoners." Fumiko wanted to reassure her, but found no words. The stories were everywhere, whispered horrors about what happened to Japanese captured by the Soviets, the Chinese, the British. Every nation had its revenge, and Japan had given them plenty of reasons. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, Unit 731's experiments. The list of atrocities was long, and now the bill was due. Around them, the American soldiers maintained their positions with military precision. They were young, most of them, probably the same age as Keiko. They didn't look cruel, but Fumiko had learned that cruelty rarely announced itself. It came quietly, dressed in official orders and justified by previous crimes. The fog began to lift, revealing more of the harbor. Through the gaps in the military vehicles, Fumiko could see Yokohama's ruins. The city had been firebombed in May, turned into an inferno that consumed 60,000 lives in a single night. What remained were skeletal buildings and scorched foundations, a landscape that looked like the end of the world. It felt appropriate somehow. The war had ended, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. An American officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the humidity. He was older than the others, maybe 40, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. Through an interpreter, he spoke. "This is a mandatory health inspection required by international law. You will be examined for infectious diseases, parasites, and injuries requiring medical attention. This is not punishment. This is protocol." The words should have been reassuring, but protocol could hide anything. Fumiko had worked in military hospitals long enough to know that medical examinations could be weaponized, that the language of care could mask the reality of violation. She thought of the comfort women, the Korean and Chinese girls forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. She had seen them in the hospitals, broken and diseased, discarded when they were no longer useful. Was this karma? Was this justice? The first woman in the front row began to unbutton her jacket. Her movements were slow, mechanical, as if her body had disconnected from her mind. Others followed, creating a ripple effect through the formation. Fumiko's hands moved to her collar, fingers numb and clumsy. Beside her, Keiko had started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. "We should refuse," someone whispered from behind. "Die with dignity." But no one moved to resist. What dignity was there in death when you'd already lost everything? The empire was gone. The emperor had surrendered. Their families were starving in the ruins of burned cities. Refusing this order wouldn't change anything. It would just be one more pointless death in a war that had consumed millions. As Fumiko removed her jacket, she felt the morning air against her skin, cool and invasive. She folded the garment carefully, old habits persisting even in humiliation. Around her, 450 women stood in various states of undress, their eyes fixed on the ground, their shoulders hunched against invisible blows. The American soldiers remained at attention, their faces carefully neutral. Fumiko noticed that some had turned slightly away, not quite looking at the women before them. One young soldier, barely more than a boy, stared fixedly at the sky, his jaw clenched tight. These small gestures registered in her mind like data points, discomfort, embarrassment, maybe even shame. But whose shame? Theirs or hers? Then something unexpected happened. A truck pulled up, and American medics began unloading equipment. Not guns, not ropes, not the instruments of torture that Fumiko's imagination had conjured. Medical supplies, stretchers, and blankets. White cotton blankets that caught the morning light and seemed to glow against the gray concrete. A female voice called out in heavily accented Japanese, "You will each receive a blanket after inspection. Hot water is being prepared for bathing. Medical staff will examine you in private tents. This will take approximately 3 hours. Please form single lines." Fumiko's mind struggled to process this information. Blankets, hot water, private examinations. This wasn't the systematic brutality she'd been preparing herself to endure. This was something else, something she didn't have a category for. As the women began to form lines, Fumiko caught the eye of the American officer who had spoken earlier. He was watching the proceedings with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction, not cruelty. Sadness, perhaps, or exhaustion. The look of a man carrying out orders he didn't fully believe in, trying to find humanity in the machinery of war. The fog had fully lifted now, and the sun broke through the clouds, turning the harbor water gold. In that moment, standing semi-naked with hundreds of other defeated women, Fumiko realized that she had no idea what came next. The certainty of death would have been easier than this uncertainty of mercy. Because mercy from an enemy was the most dangerous thing of all. It required you to rethink everything you'd been taught about good and evil, friend and foe, honor and shame. And Fumiko wasn't sure she was ready for that revolution. But ready or not, it was beginning. Part 2. The examination. The medical tent smelled of disinfectant and canvas, a combination that reminded Fumiko of field hospitals, but without the underlying stench of gangrene and death. She stood in line with 20 other women, each wrapped in the white blanket they'd been given. The fabric was rough but clean, probably military issue, stamped with the letters U.S. Army in faded black ink. Inside the tent, she could hear voices speaking in English, the occasional clatter of metal instruments, and something that surprised her. Laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the ordinary sound of people working together, making small jokes to pass the time. It was surreal, this normalcy in the midst of catastrophe. When her turn came, a young American nurse gestured her inside. The woman was perhaps 30, with red hair tucked under a white cap and freckles scattered across her nose. She smiled, a professional expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, and indicated a folding chair separated from the rest of the tent by a canvas partition. "Please sit," she said in broken Japanese, then switched to English, speaking to the interpreter. "Tell her we need to check for tuberculosis, malnutrition, and any wounds that might be infected. Standard procedure." The interpreter, an older Japanese man who wore the armband of the Allied Occupation Authority, translated in a monotone voice. Fumiko noticed he wouldn't look at her directly, as if her state of undress was something shameful he needed to pretend not to see. The nurse approached with a stethoscope, warming it between her hands before placing it against Fumiko's back. Deep breath, she instructed. The metal was still cold despite her effort, and Fumiko flinched. Sorry, the nurse said, and seemed to mean it. She listened carefully, moving the stethoscope to different positions, her face concentrated. After a moment, she made notes on a clipboard and nodded. Lungs sound clear. That's good. What followed was a thorough but surprisingly gentle examination. The nurse checked her eyes, her throat, her reflexes. She felt along Fumiko's arms and legs for injuries, pausing at an old scar on her left forearm. How did this happen? She asked through the interpreter. Fumiko hesitated, then answered, Shrapnel, during an air raid in Harbin last March. The nurse made a note, then applied some kind of ointment to the scar tissue, which had healed poorly and still looked angry and red. This should help with the scarring, she said. It might reduce the pain too if there's any nerve damage. Fumiko stared at her. Why would an American nurse care about reducing her pain? Why treat the wounds of an enemy with such care? It made no sense. In the Japanese military hospitals where she'd worked, Chinese prisoners were lucky if they received any treatment at all. Most were left to die in separate wards, given minimal food and no pain medication. The justification was always the same. Resources were scarce, and they needed to be preserved for Japanese soldiers. But here was this American woman, using precious medical supplies on a defeated enemy, treating her with the same care she'd presumably give to her own countrymen. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. You're a nurse? The American woman asked, noticing how Fumiko watched the medical procedures with professional interest. Yes, Fumiko answered in halting English. 3 years. Hospital in Harbin. The nurse's expression changed, became more interested. Then you understand what we're doing here. We're just trying to prevent disease outbreaks. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis. They don't care about nationality. If there's an epidemic, everyone suffers. It was a practical explanation, devoid of sentiment. But Fumiko heard something else beneath the words. We're doing this because it's right, not because we're required to. There was a difference, and somehow that difference mattered. As the examination concluded, the nurse handed her a small paper packet. Vitamins, she explained. Take one each day with food. You're malnourished, but not critically. You should recover quickly with proper diet. Fumiko accepted the packet, holding it like it might disappear. When was the last time she'd had access to vitamins? The Japanese military had been rationing everything by the war's end, prioritizing combat troops over medical personnel. She'd seen soldiers die of beriberi, a disease easily prevented with basic nutrition. And now the enemy was giving her vitamins. Before she left the examination area, the nurse did something that would stay with Fumiko for the rest of her life. She placed a hand briefly on her shoulder and said, in carefully practiced Japanese, War is over. You are safe now. The words should have been comforting, but instead, they broke something inside Fumiko. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, mortified by this display of weakness. The nurse pretended not to notice, busying herself with her paperwork and giving Fumiko time to compose herself. Outside the tent, the sun had climbed higher, and the day was growing hot. Fumiko rejoined the other women, many of whom wore the same expression of confused shock. They had prepared themselves for brutality and found efficiency tinged with unexpected kindness. It was harder to process than simple cruelty would have been. Keiko found her in the crowd, still wrapped in her blanket like a shield. What happened? She asked urgently. Did they hurt you? No, Fumiko answered, her voice distant. They treated me like a patient. But why? It was the question everyone was asking, whispered in small groups as they waited for the next phase of processing. Why show mercy to the enemy? Why waste resources on defeated captives? The answers they came up with were all cynical. Propaganda, to look good for international observers, to gather intelligence by winning their trust. But none of these explanations quite fit the reality of what they'd experienced. By midday, all 450 women had been examined. The American medical staff announced that 3 women needed to be hospitalized for serious conditions, one with advanced tuberculosis, another with a severe infection from an untreated wound, and a third who was in the late stages of pregnancy with complications. These 3 were loaded into an ambulance with the same care that would have been shown to American patients. Fumiko watched the ambulance drive away and thought about the pregnant woman, a civilian evacuee from Manchuria who'd been caught up in the military transport. In a Japanese military hospital, her baby would have been considered expendable, another mouth to feed in a time of scarcity. But the Americans were rushing her to a facility where she'd receive full obstetric care. The contradictions were stacking up, creating a weight that Fumiko couldn't carry using her old understanding of the world. She'd been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they viewed Japanese as subhuman, that defeat would mean enslavement or death. But every hour of captivity was disproving these teachings, replacing them with a more complicated and unsettling truth. As the afternoon wore on, the women were given their first meal in American custody: rice, canned meat, bread, and tea. The portions were generous, more food than Fumiko had seen in months. She ate slowly, watching the American soldiers who distributed the meals. They were professional, distant, but not cruel. Some looked uncomfortable, probably aware of how strange this all must seem to their prisoners. One young soldier, distributing tea, accidentally spilled some on a woman's blanket. He immediately apologized in English, grabbed a cloth, and tried to help clean it up, looking genuinely distressed by his mistake. The woman stared at him in shock, unaccustomed to apologies from those in power. These small moments accumulated like evidence in a trial, each one undermining the prosecution's case that the enemy was monstrous. But if the enemy wasn't monstrous, then what did that make the war? What did it make the things Japan had done in China, in the Philippines, in Malaya? If Americans could show humanity to their defeated foes, what excuses did Japan have for the inhumanity it had inflicted? These thoughts were dangerous, Fumiko knew. They led to places that questioned everything, that made the deaths of millions seem pointless rather than noble. It was safer to cling to the old beliefs, to maintain that America was evil and Japan was righteous, that defeat was temporary and honor was eternal. But standing in that harbor, wrapped in an enemy's blanket, eating an enemy's food, treated with an enemy's medicine, those old beliefs were becoming impossible to maintain. And Fumiko wasn't sure what would replace them. Part 3. The bathhouse. The bathhouse had been set up in a warehouse near the docks, requisitioned by the occupation forces and hastily converted for this purpose. When the women entered, they found rows of improvised showers rigged from pipes and canvas curtains that provided some privacy. Steam rose from barrels of heated water, creating a fog that softened the harsh industrial space. For many of the women, this was their first real bath in weeks. The journey from the continent had been cramped and unsanitary, with limited access to fresh water. They carried the smell of their ordeal: sweat, dirt, fear. The promise of hot water and soap was almost painful in its appeal. But the order to bathe came with anxiety. Collective bathing was normal in Japanese culture, but this was different. American soldiers guarded the perimeter, and though they weren't inside the bathhouse, their presence was felt. There was also the vulnerability of nakedness, the exposure to foreign eyes, the memory of stories about what conquerors did to the conquered. Fumiko stood at the entrance with Keiko and a group of other nurses, hesitating. An American female officer stood nearby, perhaps sensing their reluctance. She spoke through the interpreter. "You will bathe in groups of 20. You have 30 minutes. There is soap, shampoo, and clean towels. Male personnel are not permitted within 50 meters of this facility. You have privacy." The last sentence seemed emphasized, as if the officer understood the specific fear her prisoners carried. She was an older woman, maybe 50, with gray streaking her brown hair and a no-nonsense expression that reminded Fumiko of Matron Sato. There was competence in her bearing, and perhaps a hint of understanding about what these women had endured. The first group entered reluctantly, and Fumiko was among them. Inside, the reality matched the promise. The American female nurses who staffed the facility were all business, handing out soap and towels, explaining how the makeshift showers worked, maintaining a professional distance that somehow felt more respectful than friendliness would have been. When the hot water hit her skin, Fumiko closed her eyes and felt something inside her crack open. It wasn't just physical dirt being washed away. It was months of accumulated fear, humiliation, and exhaustion. The water was almost too hot, borderline painful, but she welcomed that pain because it meant she could still feel something other than numbness. She scrubbed her skin until it was red, as if she could wash away not just the dirt, but the entire experience of defeat. Around her, other women were doing the same, some crying silently, others staring at the walls with blank expressions. One woman, a teacher from Pyongyang, began to laugh, a sound that bordered on hysteria. No one told her to stop. Keiko stood under the shower next to Fumiko, her thin body revealing the extent of their malnourishment. Her ribs were visible, her collarbones sharp, her face gaunt. The war had consumed them all, turning vital young women into shadows of themselves. "I don't understand this," Keiko whispered, loud enough to be heard over the running water. "Why do they care if we're clean?" It was the question that haunted all of them. Fumiko had worked in enough military contexts to know that care required resources, time, and effort. The Americans were expending all three on enemy captives. In the brutal calculus of war, it made no sense unless there was a larger strategy at play. "Maybe they're trying to keep us healthy for labor," one woman suggested. "I heard they need workers for reconstruction." "Or they want us presentable for propaganda," another said. "Show the world how magnanimous the victors are." These explanations circulated like currency, traded between the women as they bathed. But Fumiko noticed that none of them quite believed their own theories. There was something about the quality of care they were receiving that exceeded practical necessity. It felt personal, even when delivered with professional detachment. After the shower, the women were given clean clothes, simple cotton dresses in various sizes, underwear, and even shoes. Nothing fancy, likely surplus from Red Cross supplies, but clean and intact. Fumiko held the dress up, examining it with something like wonder. It had been so long since she'd worn civilian clothes, since she'd been anything other than a nurse, a soldier, a prisoner. As she dressed, she caught her reflection in a cloudy mirror hung on the warehouse wall. The woman looking back was a stranger, thin, with short hair that had been hastily cut during the retreat from Harbin, dark circles under her eyes, skin marked by scars and sun damage. But clean. For the first time in months, clean. The American nurses collected their old uniforms in large bins. "These will be laundered and returned to you if you want them," the interpreter explained, "or they can be disposed of. Your choice." Most women chose disposal. Those uniforms represented a world that no longer existed, an identity that had been stripped away. Better to burn them than to carry that weight into whatever came next. Outside the bathhouse, the late afternoon sun was golden, casting long shadows across the harbor. The women emerged in groups, transformed by soap and water into something closer to human than they'd felt in months. American soldiers distributed small care packages: a comb, toothbrush, toothpaste, and a small mirror. These tiny toiletries, so mundane, felt like treasures. Fumiko watched as one elderly woman, a civilian doctor from Seoul, broke down crying when she received her package. She clutched the comb to her chest like it was precious metal, and maybe it was. These items represented dignity, the ability to care for oneself, to present oneself as something other than defeated and broken. That evening, as they were led to temporary barracks for the night, Fumiko overheard two American soldiers talking. They didn't realize she understood some English, picked up from working with international medical staff before the war. "Seems like a lot of effort for POWs," one said, lighting a cigarette. The other, older and carrying a medic's insignia, replied, "They're not really POWs. War's over. They're just people now, trying to get home. And besides, treating them well costs us less in the long run than dealing with disease outbreaks or resistance." "Still," the first soldier said, "after everything Japan did, the death marches, the prison camps, seems generous." The medic was quiet for a moment, exhaling smoke into the evening air. "Maybe that's the point. Show them we're different. Show them there's another way." The conversation faded as the soldiers moved away, but the words stayed with Fumiko. Show them we're different. Show them there's another way. Was that what this was? A lesson in contrast? A demonstration that mercy could be a weapon more powerful than cruelty? If so, it was working. Because every hour in American custody was making Fumiko question everything she'd believed about the righteousness of Japan's cause and the barbarity of its enemies. The propaganda machine that had sustained the war effort was crumbling under the weight of actual experience. That night, lying on a clean cot in a well-lit barracks, Fumiko couldn't sleep. Around her, 450 women wrestled with the same cognitive dissonance, the same uncomfortable realization that they'd been lied to about so many things. Some cried quietly. Others whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. A few slept, exhausted beyond the capacity for thought. Fumiko stared at the ceiling and thought about the pregnant woman who'd been taken to the hospital. She wondered if the baby had been born yet, if both mother and child would survive, if that new life would enter a world so different from the one its mother had known. And she thought about the American nurse who had treated her scar, the soldier who'd apologized for spilled tea, the medic outside who talked about showing a different way. These people were supposed to be her enemies, and maybe they still were. But they were also human, capable of kindness even when kindness wasn't strategically necessary. That realization was more devastating than any bomb, more destructive than any battlefield defeat. Because it meant that the war, with all its death and suffering, might have been avoidable. That the millions who died might have died for lies and pride, and the failure of imagination that made it impossible to see the humanity in the other side. These thoughts followed Fumiko into restless sleep, where she dreamed of bridges burning and waters too wide to cross, of reaching out to hands she couldn't quite touch, of words and languages she almost understood but couldn't quite translate. Part 4. The Waiting. 3 weeks passed in a strange limbo. The women were housed in a converted school building in Yokohama, waiting for the bureaucracy of repatriation to process them. During this time, they existed in a pocket universe where the war was over, but peace hadn't quite arrived, where they were prisoners who weren't imprisoned, captives who were cared for. The routine became familiar: breakfast at 7, medical checks twice weekly, English lessons offered in the afternoons, and evening meals followed by free time in the communal spaces. The Americans ran the facility with military efficiency, but without brutality. Rules were enforced, but not with violence. Infractions resulted in loss of privileges, not beatings. Fumiko volunteered to work in the medical clinic that had been set up to serve the detainees. Her nursing skills were valuable, and the work gave her purpose during the long waiting. She found herself working alongside American medical staff, and the collaboration was stranger than she'd expected. The American doctor in charge was a man named Captain Robert Morrison, a surgeon from California who spoke minimal Japanese but possessed an expressive face that communicated more than words. He was probably 40, with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore the scars of years of surgery. Fumiko watched him work and recognized a fellow professional, someone who took pride in precision and care. One afternoon, they worked together on a difficult case: a woman who had developed a serious infection from an untreated injury sustained during the Soviet invasion. The infection had spread, and without intervention, she would die. Captain Morrison laid out the instruments and explained through the interpreter what needed to be done. "I'll need to drain the abscess and clean the wound thoroughly," he said. "It's going to be painful. Can you assist and keep her calm?" Fumiko nodded. She had assisted in countless surgeries during her time in Harbin, though with much cruder equipment and limited supplies. She positioned herself at the patient's head, holding her hand and speaking softly in Japanese while Captain Morrison worked. The procedure was delicate. The infection was worse than it had appeared externally, and the captain had to cut deeper than expected. His hands moved with practiced confidence, but Fumiko noticed the tension in his jaw, the concentration in his eyes. He cared about this patient, this enemy woman, this person who represented a nation that had caused immense suffering to Allied forces. When it was over and the woman was bandaged and sedated, Captain Morrison cleaned his instruments with meticulous care. Fumiko helped, falling into the familiar rhythm of post-surgical cleanup. For a moment, it felt almost normal, like they were colleagues in any hospital anywhere in the world. "You're good at this," the captain said through the interpreter. "You have good instincts." Fumiko felt a flush of pride before catching herself. Why should she care about an American doctor's approval? But she did care, she realized. Professional recognition transcended nationality. They were both healers, and in that moment, the commonality mattered more than the differences. As the days passed, Fumiko found herself learning not just medical techniques, but language. The American nurses taught her English phrases, and she taught them Japanese words. The exchange was practical, necessary for working together, but it became something more. A bridge between worlds that had been at war. Lieutenant Sarah Wells, the head nurse, was particularly patient with language instruction. She was from Iowa, a place Fumiko had never heard of, and she spoke with a flat accent that was initially difficult to understand. But she was kind, and kindness in a foreign language was still kindness. "Why did you become a nurse?" Sarah asked one day during a break, speaking slowly so Fumiko could understand. Fumiko thought about how to answer in her limited English. "Want to help people," she said finally. "Make better the suffering." Sarah smiled. "Same reason I did. Funny how we ended up on opposite sides of a war." It was funny, in a tragic way. Here were two women who had chosen professions dedicated to healing, whose nations had sent them to war zones where their countrymen worked to undo everything they were trying to accomplish. The absurdity of it was overwhelming when you actually stopped to think about it. "Your country do bad things in China," Fumiko said hesitantly, testing the waters of honest conversation. "I hear stories. Prisoners treated cruel." Sarah's expression became serious. "Yes," she acknowledged. "Some of our people did terrible things. War brings out the worst in humans, no matter which uniform they're wearing. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose to be better." This concept, choosing to be better, was revolutionary to Fumiko. In the Japanese military culture, you followed orders and maintained discipline. Individual choice about how to treat enemies wasn't part of the equation. But here was Sarah, suggesting that even in war, even when dealing with those who had committed atrocities, you could choose mercy over vengeance. The women in the detention facility began to change during those 3 weeks. The weight they gained from regular meals showed in their faces first, filling out the hollows that starvation had carved. Their skin cleared. Their hair grew. They began to look less like prisoners and more like people recovering from a long illness. But the deeper changes were less visible. Conversations in the communal areas shifted from fear and shame to curiosity and questions. What was America like? Would Japan become like America? Would they be able to rebuild? Could forgiveness happen after so much blood? Keiko, who had been withdrawn and fearful in the early days, slowly emerged from her shell. She had a facility for languages and picked up English quickly. She began helping with translation, serving as an informal bridge between the American staff and Japanese detainees. Fumiko watched her transform from a terrified girl into someone with purpose and confidence. One evening, Keiko approached Fumiko with a troubled expression. "Can I ask you something?" They sat in a corner of the communal room, away from others. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, a steady rhythm that provided privacy through sound. "The Americans have been kind to us," Keiko said. "Much kinder than we deserve, considering what Japan did. But I keep wondering, is this real? Or is it just strategy? Are they being nice because they want something from us?" Fumiko had wondered the same thing. "Does it matter?" she asked. "If the result is that we're treated well, does the motivation change that?" "I think it does," Keiko insisted. "If it's strategy, then it's manipulation. If it's genuine compassion, then—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Then we were wrong about everything," Fumiko finished. "Wrong about the enemy, wrong about the war, wrong about what honor means." They sat in silence, watching the rain. Outside, American soldiers moved through the compound on patrol, their presence now familiar rather than threatening. The strange thing was how quickly humans could adapt to new circumstances, how yesterday's terror could become today's normal. "I don't know if I can go home," Keiko whispered. "After everything I've seen here, how can I go back and pretend none of this happened? How can I look my family in the eye and tell them that the enemy showed me more humanity than our own military did? It was a question without an answer, a dilemma that all of them faced. They were being repatriated to a Japan that no longer existed, returning as people who no longer fit the mold that had shaped them. They had been broken and remade, and the new form didn't match the old specifications. Fumiko thought about her family in Osaka, her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother. Were they even alive after the firebombing? Would they understand what she'd experienced? Or would they see her as tainted by enemy contact, compromised by accepting American mercy? We go back because there's nowhere else, Fumiko said finally. And maybe we carry this experience with us. Maybe it means something. Maybe it changes something. Or maybe it gets buried, Keiko said. Another secret to keep. Another part of the war that's too complicated to talk about. She was probably right. History would be written by those who needed simple narratives. Clear villains and heroes, obvious good and evil. The messy truth of moments like these, where enemies showed compassion and captives learned uncomfortable lessons about their own side, would likely be footnoted or forgotten. But it had happened, and the women who experienced it would carry that truth inside them, even if they never spoke it aloud. The memory of hot water and clean towels, of antibiotics freely given, of professional respect between nurses who should have been enemies, of small kindnesses offered without expectation of return. These memories would complicate the official stories, create cognitive dissonance in quiet moments, make simple hatred impossible for those who had experienced the alternative. And maybe that was worth something. Maybe that was how wars actually ended. Not with treaties and ceremonies, but with individual moments of recognition that the person across from you was human too. Part 5. The letters. The letter writing began spontaneously, without official permission or encouragement. Someone found a cache of paper in a supply closet, salvaged from the school that had occupied the building before the war. The sheets were yellowed and water-stained, but they were paper, and paper meant the possibility of communication. Word spread quickly through the facility. Women began writing letters to families they hadn't heard from in months or years, desperate to know who had survived the bombings and battles. They wrote in cramped handwriting, trying to fit as much information as possible on each precious page, aware that there was no guarantee the letters would ever reach their destinations. Fumiko sat at a table in the communal room, a single sheet before her, trying to decide what to say. How could she explain the last 3 months to her family? How could she describe the surrender, the capture, the unexpected mercy? What words existed for the transformation she was undergoing? She began simply, "I am alive. I am being held by American forces in Yokohama. I am healthy and well treated. I will come home when repatriation is arranged." But these facts felt inadequate, like describing a thunderstorm by noting that it rained. She wanted to tell them about the American nurse who had cared for her scar, about Captain Morrison's surgical precision, about the moment she realized that the enemy was capable of kindness. But would they understand? Or would they see her words as betrayal, as evidence that captivity had broken her spirit and made her sympathetic to the enemy? She added another line. "The Americans follow the Geneva Convention. We receive medical care and adequate food. Do not worry about me." Even this felt dangerous, like she was praising the enemy. But it was true, and truth felt important in a world that had been built on lies. She folded the letter carefully and addressed it to her family home in Osaka, knowing that the house might not exist anymore, that the address might lead to rubble and ash. Around her, other women wrote similar letters, each one a careful navigation between honesty and loyalty, between describing reality and maintaining the fiction that Japan's cause had been righteous and its enemies evil. Some women cried as they wrote, mourning family members they knew were likely dead. Others wrote with determined focus, as if the act of writing could conjure their loved ones back into existence. Keiko sat nearby chewing on her pen, staring at a blank page. "I don't know what to tell them," she confessed to Fumiko. "My father is a colonel. He would rather I died than accept enemy mercy. How do I write a letter that won't shame him but doesn't lie about what's happening?" It was an impossible task, and they both knew it. The letters they wrote would reveal them as survivors, and survival in defeat carried its own stigma in Japanese military culture. They should have died rather than surrender. They should have chosen death over captivity. That they were alive and writing letters was itself a form of dishonor. "Tell them you're coming home," Fumiko suggested quietly. "Tell them you survived. The rest can wait until you're face to face." But would they ever be able to tell the full truth, even face to face? Or would these experiences be buried, filed away as shameful memories too complicated to share? That night, Lieutenant Sarah Wells appeared in the communal room with an announcement. "The letters you've written will be processed through military postal channels. They will be inspected for security purposes, but then delivered through the Japanese postal system as it's restored. We'll do our best to ensure they reach your families." The relief in the room was palpable. These letters represented connection, the possibility of reunion, proof that despite everything, the threads that bound families together hadn't been completely severed. Women clutched their letters like lifelines, handed them over to the American staff with expressions of desperate hope. But there was another kind of letter being written, one that was more dangerous and more honest. Some women, Fumiko among them, began keeping journals. They wrote not to send home, but to record, to process, to make sense of an experience that defied simple categorization. Fumiko's journal entries were fragmentary, written late at night by whatever light she could find. October 5th, 1945. Today, I assisted Captain Morrison with an emergency surgery. A woman's appendix burst. He worked for 3 hours to save her life. When it was over, he looked exhausted but satisfied. He thanked me for my help in English. I understood not just the words but the meaning behind them, respect between professionals. How strange that respect should feel so revolutionary. October 8, 1945. Keiko asked me today why the Americans don't hate us. I told her I don't know, but I think it's because they've seen enough death. Hatred requires energy, and they're too tired. Or maybe that's not it. Maybe they genuinely believe in their principles, in human rights and dignity, even for enemies. If so, that belief is more powerful than any weapon. October 12, 1945. Lieutenant Wells taught me a new English phrase today, turning the page. She said it means moving past something, starting fresh. I like this image, the idea that history is a book, and you can simply turn to a new page. But what happens to the old pages? Do they disappear, or do they remain ready to be turned back to and reread? These journal entries were dangerous because they were honest, because they recorded thoughts that could be interpreted as sympathizing with the enemy, as abandoning loyalty to Japan. But Fumiko couldn't stop writing them. The journal was where she could be truthful without fear, where she could work through the cognitive dissonance that threatened to tear her mind apart. One evening, she discovered she wasn't alone in this practice. She found several other women sitting in a corner of the room, sharing their journals, reading passages aloud to each other in whispers. They had formed a secret circle, a space where they could acknowledge the complicated truth of their situation without judgment. An older woman named Mrs. Yamamoto, a teacher who had been evacuated from Manchuria, read from her journal. "I taught my students that Japan was the light of Asia, bringing civilization to backwards peoples. But here I am, receiving civilization from those I called barbaric. What does this make me? A fool? A victim of propaganda? Both?" The honesty was painful, but also liberating. These women were allowing themselves to question, to doubt, to reconsider everything they'd been taught. It was a form of rebellion more profound than any physical resistance could have been. Fumiko shared her own entry about respect between professionals, and several women nodded in recognition. They had experienced similar moments, brief instances where common humanity transcended national identity, where shared purpose mattered more than historical enmity. "We can't talk about this when we go home," one woman said, stating what they all knew. "No one will understand. They'll call us traitors or say we were brainwashed. Then we write it down," Mrs. Yamamoto said firmly. "We record it honestly, even if we never share it. Because the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. Maybe especially then." They agreed to continue their journals, to document their experiences with as much honesty as they could muster, to create a record that future historians might find and use to understand this complicated moment in history. It was a small act of defiance against the simplification of narrative, against the reduction of complex human experiences into propaganda points for one side or another. But their quiet rebellion was about to be tested. The next morning, an announcement came that would force them to confront the reality of repatriation and what it meant to return to a Japan that had been transformed by defeat. Part 6. The News. The announcement came during breakfast, delivered by a Japanese official who wore the armband of the new occupation authority. His face was grave as he stepped to the front of the dining hall, and the women sensed immediately that something significant had happened. The imperial government has issued new directives regarding repatriation, he began, his voice formal and stiff. All personnel returning to Japan will be required to undergo screening and debriefing. There will be questions about your conduct during captivity, about information you may have shared with enemy forces, about your cooperation with the occupation authorities. The word cooperation hung in the air like an accusation. The women exchanged worried glances. They had cooperated, of course. They had followed rules, accepted medical care, eaten American food, learned English phrases, worked alongside their captors. What choice did they have? But choice, apparently, was not a defense in the new moral calculus being constructed in post-surrender Japan. Additionally, the official continued, you should be aware that Japan is facing severe food shortages. The bombed cities are struggling to feed their populations. Repatriation is happening slowly because the country cannot absorb large numbers of returnees all at once. You may be here for several more months. The news hit like a physical blow. Several more months in limbo, neither prisoner nor free, suspended between two worlds. And when they finally returned, they would face interrogation and suspicion, would have to justify their survival and their conduct to authorities who would view them through a lens of shame and defeat. Fumiko felt the walls closing in. She had thought repatriation would be a return to normal life, or at least to something resembling it. But there was no normal to return to. Japan had been shattered, not just physically, but psychologically. The nation that had believed itself invincible had been proven catastrophically wrong, and someone would have to pay for that failure. The survivors, it seemed, would be convenient scapegoats. That afternoon, Lieutenant Wells gathered the women who worked in the medical clinic. Her expression was troubled, and she spoke more hesitantly than usual through the interpreter. I want you to know that we're aware of the situation you'll face when you return home, she said. We understand that your cooperation with us here might be viewed negatively by some in Japan. I want you to know that we never meant to put you in that position. It was a remarkable statement, an acknowledgement that mercy could have consequences, that helping the enemy could be dangerous even when the war was over. The American authorities had assumed that humanitarian treatment would be welcomed without complication, but they were learning that the psychology of defeat was more complex than they'd anticipated. We're working with the Japanese authorities to ensure that returnees are treated fairly, Wells continued. But I can't make promises about what will happen. What I can say is that your work here has been valuable, and you should be proud of the care you've provided to your fellow countrymen. She paused, then added something off script, speaking directly in her halting Japanese. You are good nurses, good people. Remember that. After she left, Fumiko sat with the other medical workers in silence. They all understood the implications. Their cooperation, born of necessity and professionalism, would mark them as suspect. The skills they had learned, the relationships they had built, the small kindnesses they had accepted, all of it would be weaponized against them in the post-war reckoning. Keiko was the first to speak. Maybe we don't go back. The suggestion was so radical that for a moment no one responded. Not return to Japan? But where else could they go? They were Japanese women with no resources, no connections in other countries, no legal status beyond their pending repatriation. The world was not set up to accommodate people who wanted to exist outside their national identities. We don't have a choice, Mrs. Yamamoto said gently. Our families are there, our culture, our language, everything we know. We can't just become American or British or Australian. That's not how the world works. But we can't become Japanese again either, Keiko argued. Not the way we were. We're different now. We've seen too much. We know too much. It was true, and they all felt it. They were caught between identities, no longer fitting the mold of loyal Japanese subjects, but not able to transform into something else. They were liminal beings, existing in the space between worlds, and that space was rapidly becoming uncomfortable. That evening, Fumiko wrote in her journal, Keiko asked if we could choose not to return. The question reveals how thoroughly we've been transformed. Before the war, such a thought would have been unimaginable, a betrayal so profound it couldn't even be conceived. But now we can imagine it, even if we can't act on it. The prison of identity has been unlocked, and even though we'll walk back into it voluntarily, we'll always know that the lock was an illusion. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the facility shifted. The women became more withdrawn, less willing to engage with the American staff. The easy camaraderie that had been developing was replaced by a cautious distance. They were beginning to perform the identity they would need when they returned home, practicing being victims rather than collaborators, captives rather than recipients of care. The American staff noticed the change but didn't understand it. They thought perhaps they had done something to offend, or that the stress of waiting was taking its toll. In a way, both were true. But the deeper truth was that the women were preparing for re-entry into a society that would view their survival as suspicious and their treatment by the enemy as shameful. Captain Morrison approached Fumiko one day in the clinic, his expression concerned. Through the interpreter, he asked, "Have I done something to upset you? You seem distant lately." How could she explain? How could she tell him that every kindness he had shown her was becoming a liability, that the professional respect they had developed was something she would have to deny or minimize when questioned by Japanese authorities? "No," she said simply. "You have been very kind. Too kind." He looked confused by the qualification, and she didn't try to explain further. How could someone from a victorious nation understand the psychology of defeat, the way shame and honor became twisted into impossible knots that survivors had to unravel alone? But that night, she broke her own rule about maintaining distance. She wrote him a letter in English, carefully composed with the help of a dictionary. "Dear Captain Morrison, I write to thank you for your professionalism and kindness during my time working with you. You treated me as colleague, not as enemy. This gift is more valuable than you know. When I return to Japan, I may not speak of these days. My country will ask questions I cannot answer honestly without causing shame to myself and my family. But I want you to know that your actions have taught me something important, that healing is more powerful than hatred, that the choice to see humanity in others is a brave choice. You showed me a different way of being in the world. I will carry this lesson, even if I carry it in silence. With respect and gratitude, Fumiko Tanaka." She sealed the letter and left it on his desk before she could change her mind. The next morning, she found a response, written in halting Japanese with many corrections. "Nurse Tanaka, your letter honors me more than you know. Working with you has reminded me why I became a doctor. War makes us forget that our job is to heal, not to harm. You helped me remember. I hope Japan treats you with the kindness you deserve. I hope your family understands what you've endured. And I hope someday that the world learns to choose healing over hatred. You are an excellent nurse and a brave woman. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. With respect, Robert Morrison." Fumiko folded the letter carefully and hid it in the lining of her jacket, the same place she had hidden her journal. These words were too precious and too dangerous to leave visible. They would be her secret, carried home like contraband, proof that another way of being had briefly existed. The weeks continued, October turning to November, the weather growing cooler. News from Japan trickled in through official channels. The occupation was proceeding, war trials were beginning, the emperor had renounced his divinity. Each piece of information revealed a world being remade, old certainties dissolving, new realities taking shape. The women adapted to their extended limbo, creating routines and structures that made the waiting bearable. Some continued to work in the clinic or help with administrative tasks. Others taught classes in Japanese language and culture, sharing their knowledge with American soldiers who would be stationed in Japan. The irony of helping the occupiers understand the country they were occupying was not lost on anyone. Through it all, the journals continued. The secret circle of women who wrote honestly about their experiences grew larger, eventually including nearly half the detainees. They had created their own community within the facility, bound not by shared ideology, but by shared confusion, by the common experience of having their worldview shattered and not yet knowing what would replace it. Mrs. Yamamoto became the informal keeper of their collective memory. She proposed that they create a hidden archive, copies of their journals and letters that would be sealed and preserved, perhaps to be opened years or decades later, when the wounds of war had healed enough that honest testimony could be heard. "We owe it to history," she said, "to tell the truth, even if we can't tell it now, even if we never tell it. The truth has value regardless of whether anyone hears it." They worked on this project in secret, copying passages from their journals by hand, carefully documenting dates and events, creating a record that challenged the simplified narratives already forming about the war's end. It was tedious work, done late at night by candlelight, but it felt important. They were witnesses, and their testimony mattered. Fumiko contributed her journal entries about Captain Morrison, about Lieutenant Wells, about the moment she realized that the enemy was capable of systematic kindness. She wrote about the cognitive dissonance of receiving better medical care from her captors than she had provided to prisoners in her own hospital, about the shame that came with that realization. As November turned to December, word came that the first group would be repatriated in January. Names would be announced soon, but priority would go to civilians and non-military personnel. Fumiko, as a military nurse, would likely be in a later group. The waiting would continue. But the waiting had changed her, had changed all of them. They were not the same women who had stood on that dock in September, terrified and prepared for the worst. They had survived not just captivity, but transformation, and they carried that transformation inside them like a secret that would shape the rest of their lives. Part 7. The Return. The announcement came on a gray morning in late January 1946. Fumiko's name was on the list for the next repatriation ship, scheduled to depart in 3 days. After 4 months in American custody, she was going home. The word home felt strange in her mouth, uncertain of its meaning. The women whose names had been called moved through the next few days in a daze, collecting their few possessions, saying goodbye to those who would remain behind. The American staff organized a simple ceremony, nothing elaborate, just a gathering in the main hall where Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Wells gave brief speeches through the interpreter. "You have shown great dignity during your time here," Morrison said. "You have endured difficulty with grace, and many of you have contributed valuable service in caring for your fellow countrymen. We wish you safe journey and hope you find your families well." The words were formal, appropriate, but Fumiko heard something beneath them. Regret, perhaps, or uncertainty about what fate awaited these women in a Japan that was itself imprisoned by occupation and defeat. The Americans had done their best to treat their captives humanely, but they were learning that in the aftermath of total war, there were no simple good deeds, no kindness without complications. Lieutenant Wells was more personal in her remarks, speaking slowly in Japanese she had learned during these months. "You are strong women, brave women. Remember this when others tell you different. Remember your strength." It was advice born of understanding, recognition, that the women were returning to a society that might not celebrate their survival, that might view their endurance as evidence of insufficient loyalty. Wells had seen enough of military culture to know that survivors of defeat were often treated as failures rather than heroes. That last night, Fumiko couldn't sleep. She walked through the facility one final time, memorizing details she knew would fade. The worn floorboards of the communal room, the view of the harbor from the second-floor windows, the smell of disinfectant and tea that had defined this strange interlude. She found herself in the medical clinic, running her hands over equipment she had used, remembering procedures and patients and small moments of professional satisfaction. Captain Morrison found her there, appearing in the doorway like a ghost. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked in English. "No sleep," she confirmed, her English still halting but functional after 4 months of practice. They stood in silence for a moment, Two people who had worked together, learned to respect each other, who would now return to separate worlds where such respect might not be permissible. "I worry for you," Morrison said quietly. "I've heard things about how Japan is treating returnees, the suspicion, the interrogations. I want you to know that if there's anything in your conduct here that might cause you trouble, I'll provide documentation that you acted only as a medical professional, that you showed no disloyalty to your country." Fumiko felt tears prick her eyes. This offer of protection from an enemy officer, this attempt to shield her from her own people's judgment, was almost unbearable in its kindness. "Thank you," she said. "But better. Better if I not mention you. Better if I forget this time." "Can you forget?" he asked. "Should you?" She thought about her journal, hidden in her jacket lining, pages and pages of honest testimony about transformation and doubt. "No," she admitted. "I cannot forget, but I can be silent." "Silence protects," Morrison acknowledged, "but it also imprisons. I hope someday you can tell this story. I hope someday the world is ready to hear complicated truths." They shook hands, formally, a gesture that had become familiar through their work together. His grip was firm, respectful, the handshake of equals. Then he did something unexpected. He bowed slightly in the Japanese manner. It was awkward, an American's approximation of a gesture he didn't fully understand, but the intent was clear. He was honoring her, acknowledging her dignity as a fellow professional and human being. Fumiko bowed in return, deeper, holding the bow longer than necessary, letting it carry all the gratitude and confusion and grief she couldn't express in words. When she straightened, Morrison had already turned away, giving her privacy for emotions she couldn't fully control. The next morning, the repatriation group assembled in the courtyard. They had been issued travel clothes, simple but clean, and each woman carried a small bag with her few possessions. The American soldiers who had guarded them for 4 months now lined up to see them off, their expressions unreadable. Buses arrived to take them to the port where a ship waited, an old transport vessel that had been converted to carry civilians. As Fumiko climbed aboard the bus, she looked back at the facility one last time. Keiko stood at the fence, waving. She would be in the next group, departing in February. They had promised to find each other in Japan, though both knew the promise might be impossible to keep. The port was chaos, thousands of repatriates being processed, Japanese officials with clipboards checking names, American military police maintaining order, vendors selling tea and rice balls to those with money. The ship loomed above it all, rust-streaked and weather-beaten, a symbol of transition between worlds. Boarding was slow, each person having to show documentation, answer questions, be verified against lists. When Fumiko's turn came, a Japanese official looked at her papers and frowned. "Military nurse?" he asked, his tone making the question sound like an accusation. "Yes," she confirmed. "You will need to report to the Military Assistance Bureau within 1 week of arrival for debriefing. You understand this is mandatory?" "I understand." He stamped her papers and waved her through, but his expression carried judgment. She was marked now, identified as someone who needed watching, whose loyalty required verification. The ship's hold had been converted into makeshift accommodations, rows of bunks stacked 3 high with narrow aisles between. It smelled of rust, salt, and too many bodies in too small a space. Fumiko found her assigned bunk and claimed it, stowing her bag underneath. As more women boarded, the space filled with nervous chatter and whispered speculations. What would they find when they arrived? Would their families be there to meet them? What questions would they face? Everyone was anxious, no one certain. The ship departed at sunset, its horn blasting across the harbor in a mournful call. Women crowded at the portholes and on deck, watching Yokohama recede into the distance. For many, this was the last they would see of the American occupation facilities, the strange liminal space where they had been neither prisoner nor free, where the enemy had shown unexpected humanity. The voyage took 2 days, rough seas making many sick. Fumiko spent most of the journey on deck, preferring fresh air to the stuffiness below. She watched the waves, hypnotic in their repetition, and thought about what awaited her. Osaka had been firebombed in March, one of the deadliest raids of the war. She had received a letter through the Red Cross confirming that her parents and brother had survived, but their home had been destroyed. They were living with relatives in a suburb that had been largely spared, but survived covered a lot of territory. Were they healthy, starving, broken by defeat? And what would she tell them about her months in American custody? How could she explain that she had been treated well, that she had worked alongside enemy doctors, that she had learned to respect some of her captors? In the Japan she was returning to, such admissions might mark her as contaminated, as someone whose loyalty had been compromised. She touched her jacket, feeling the outline of her hidden journal. This record of truth would have to remain secret, possibly forever. The complicated reality of her experience would be flattened into simple narrative. Captured, detained, repatriated. Everything in between would be erased or simplified beyond recognition. On the morning of the third day, Japan appeared on the horizon. Not the Japan of Fumiko's memory with its proud cities and efficient military, but a Japan reduced and humbled. As they entered Osaka Bay, the devastation became visible. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by fields of rubble. Buildings stood as shells, their walls intact but their interiors gutted by fire. The few structures that remained whole looked wrong, isolated survivors in a landscape of destruction. The port was crowded with people, thousands of families hoping to find returning relatives. American soldiers were everywhere, supervising the disembarkation, maintaining order, representing the new reality of occupation. The Japanese flag still flew, but beside it now was the stars and stripes, and everyone understood which one held actual authority. The women disembarked slowly, processed through checkpoints where their papers were examined by both Japanese and American officials. Fumiko presented her documents, answered basic questions, and was directed toward a separate area marked Military Personnel, Debriefing Required. In this waiting area, she sat with other former military nurses, all of them silent and anxious. After an hour, they were called one by one into a temporary office where Japanese military officials, themselves operating under American supervision, conducted initial interviews. When Fumiko's turn came, she entered a small room where two men sat behind a table. One was older, a colonel by his insignia, with a face carved by defeat and resentment. The other was younger, a captain, taking notes. "Nurse Tanaka," the colonel began, his voice flat. "You were attached to the Harbin Field Hospital until the Soviet invasion?" "Yes, sir." "And then?" She recounted her journey, the retreat to Korea, the ship to Japan, the interception by American forces, the detention in Yokohama. She kept her answers brief, factual, devoid of emotion or judgment. "During your detention, did you cooperate with enemy forces?" The question was a trap, she understood. If she said no, she would be lying, and lies could be verified. If she said yes, she admitted to collaboration. "I followed the instructions of my captors and provided medical care to my fellow detainees when asked," she said carefully. "As a nurse, I could not refuse to treat sick and injured people." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Did you develop relationships with enemy personnel?" "I worked alongside American medical staff in the clinic. Professional relationships only." "Did they interrogate you about military matters?" "No, sir. They seemed to have little interest in military intelligence from medical personnel." This was true, if incomplete. The Americans had been focused on processing and repatriating civilians, not on extracting intelligence from nurses who had been far from combat theaters. The questioning continued for another hour, probing her conduct, her attitudes, her opinions about the occupation. Fumiko navigated each question carefully, saying enough to seem cooperative, but not so much as to reveal the true depth of her experience. She mentioned nothing about Morrison's respect, Wells's kindness, or the moment she realized that mercy could transcend national boundaries. Finally, the colonel stamped her papers. "You are to report to this office once a month for the next 6 months. You will inform us immediately of any contact with occupation forces. You will submit a written report of your detention within 1 week. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You may go." She left the office, her hands shaking, and emerged into the chaos of the port. Families were reuniting all around her, tears and embraces and the messy joy of survival. She scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces, and then she saw him, her younger brother Takeshi, waving frantically. He had grown since she'd last seen him, no longer a boy but a young man of 17. They embraced, and Fumiko felt her carefully maintained composure crack. She wept against his shoulder while he held her, whispering that everyone was alive, that they had waited so long, that they were so worried. When she finally pulled back, she saw her parents standing behind Takeshi. Her father looked older, thinner, his face lined with new wrinkles. Her mother had gone gray, her hair now streaked with white, but they were alive, and in that moment, that was everything. They didn't speak much on the journey to the suburb where they were living. The city passing outside the train windows was almost unrecognizable, familiar landmarks gone or transformed by destruction. Fumiko stared out the window and realized that home was not a place you could return to. It was a moment in time, and that moment had passed. The relative's house was small, crowded with too many people in too little space. Her family occupied a single room, 6 tatami mats where they slept, ate, and lived their reduced existence. It was a far cry from the comfortable house where Fumiko had grown up, but it was shelter, and shelter was luxury in this new Japan. That first night, sitting on the tatami with her family around her, eating a simple meal of rice and pickled vegetables, Fumiko felt the weight of all she couldn't say pressing down on her. Her mother asked about her detention, and Fumiko gave the simple version. She had been held with other Japanese women. They had been treated according to international law. She had been allowed to practice nursing, and now she was home. "Were you mistreated?" her father asked, his voice carrying expectations she understood. "No," she said quietly. "They followed proper procedures." She saw disappointment flicker across his face, as if her lack of suffering was itself a failure. The narrative of Japanese victimhood required enemy cruelty, and her experience didn't fit the template. Her mother, more perceptive, asked, "But it must have been difficult? To be in enemy hands?" "Yes," Fumiko said, seizing on this lifeline. "It was very difficult, very uncertain. I didn't know if I would ever see you again." This was true, and it satisfied them. They wanted to hear about her fear and anxiety, not about moments of kindness or professional respect. They wanted confirmation that the enemy was evil, not complicated testimony about humanity in unexpected places. That night, lying on her futon in the shared room, listening to her family's breathing in the dark, Fumiko touched the journal hidden in her jacket. She had brought it home, carried her secret across the water. But when would she ever be able to share what she had written? When would Japan be ready to hear that the enemy had shown more mercy than honor required? That defeat had taught lessons pride had obscured? Maybe never. Maybe the truth of those months would remain locked inside her, shared only with the other women who had lived it, whispered in private moments when they were sure no one else could hear. Maybe that was the price of surviving. You carried your complicated truths in silence, let the official histories be written by those who needed simple narratives, and learned to live with the gap between what happened and what could be said. Outside, she could hear American vehicles passing on the street, the sounds of occupation that would become the soundtrack of daily life for years to come. The war was over, but its aftermath was just beginning, and Fumiko understood that she would spend the rest of her life navigating the space between enemy and ally, between what she knew and what she was allowed to say, between the person she had become and the person her country expected her to be. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep was elusive. The memories came unbidden. Morrison's careful surgical technique, Wells's patient language lessons, the moment of standing clean and wrapped in a blanket, realizing that mercy existed even in war's aftermath. These memories were precious and dangerous, treasures she would have to keep hidden like contraband. And so began her life after war, a life defined not just by what had happened, but by all that could never be spoken, all the complicated truths that would remain forever sealed in journals and whispered conversations, in the secret history carried by women who had seen the enemy's face and found it impossibly human.